Hey there, I am Barb Higgins, and this is 1,000 Tiny Steps. In this podcast, I share my stories of love, loss, triumph, and tragedy as I continue to retrace my steps and ponder what led to the death of my daughter Molly. By doing so, I hope to not only help myself, but to bring purpose and possibility to those who listen. If you are ready to laugh, cry, shake your head in disbelief, then tie, buckle, lace up, or slip on your shoes, and join me as we begin our 1,000 Tiny Steps.
Hey everybody, Barb Higgins here, welcoming you to episode 111 of 1,000 Tiny Steps. So for the third time in the history of my podcast, I have company today. Virginia is here, Virginia Macgregor. She is the magical angel from the universe who put together Motherland for me, which is my memoir around Molly and Jack. And I have her here today because a week from today, Motherland will hit the bookstores. We're doing a book signing in Concord at our local bookstore, Gibson's. And so, hi, Virginia.
Hi.
So Molly died in 2016. And we all know I spent 2 or 3 years really struggling, just in the depths of despair and unable to really do anything. And as I pulled myself out and started sort of working through things like brain tumors and kidney transplants, life, believe it or not, seemed to feel a little bit better. And along with all this came COVID. And Virginia came to New Hampshire from England. They became part of Concord's community. And then COVID hit. So in all of this, Virginia and I became Facebook friends. I noticed her from her sweet Tennessee Sky dancing at Concord Dance Academy. And then I wrote a couple of blogs and somehow we just started talking. And all of those things led up to a fateful day on my back porch, which we'll talk about in a bit. But first of all, I want you all to get to know Virginia and the wonderful works of fiction that she has brought into the universe and shared with lots and lots of readers. Just tell me a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Barb. It's such an honor to be on this podcast. And it was such an honor to write this book with you. And I'm really excited to talk about Motherland in a moment as well. So I can't remember a time in my life when I didn't want to be a writer. I think as soon as I understood that there was someone behind the stories that I loved growing up as a child, I just thought what a magical thing it would be to be the person who writes these stories. It's been with me my entire life. It's taken me a little while to give myself permission to call myself a writer, to set aside enough time to actually write and publish books. It was actually meeting my husband, who's also an artist of sorts, who is a great coach and a great sort of mentor, as well as a wonderful husband. And I always say he sort of loved me into being a writer. We were teaching together at the same time. I was teaching English and running a dorm. And he just said, you've always wanted to be a writer. You've written all your holidays and vacations. And why don't you give yourself some time to write full time? And that's what I did. I took a year. I did an MFA in creative writing. I wrote my heart out every day like a full-time job. And by the end of the year, after many ups and downs, I got a publishing deal. And I've always had a passion really for telling people stories and writing, especially contemporary fiction. I love novels that give us a snapshot of how we live now. I think that they are uniquely placed. The novel form is uniquely placed to tell stories of how we live. And if we look at the history of the novel, whether it's Charles Dickens or Jane Austen, they wrote about the times in which they lived and they were able to give us the real essence of that time. And one of the things I loved about writing Motherland is I feel like, Barb, you're sort of the every woman, you and your story and your life and your losses and your successes. They give us not only an insight into your life, but a snapshot of what it means to live in the 21st century, to be a mother in America, to be a mother who's lost a child, a mother who's had a child through extraordinary means. And so all my books, my contemporary stories, they try to address some of the issues of what it means to be alive today, some of the knotty, complicated, confusing, beautiful aspects of being alive. And I think that's what resonated with you when you read my books, and maybe you recognized something of yourself in there and you thought, wow, actually my story might be similar to the fictional stories that she writes.
Actually, I felt that a lot. It was The Return of Nora Wells, which was a book you wrote about 2 women and a guy. Classic triangle. Yay, there it is. Nora leaves, and I'm just going to sort of leave the details of the story at that. But if you know me, you all need to read this book. But I really related to her character because of the conflict she was in. And I also related to the ways that her friend and the father of her children, dealt with it all. That was probably the first time I felt that I truly had permission to really share my life. That was a work of fiction, but I could have lived 80% of those pages myself. I read for enjoyment and entertainment, but you're right. There's a lot to learn in reading these fictional stories that could actually totally be true and probably are true somewhere.
I just think story is more important now than, well, it's always been important in society. I think we're hardwired to respond to story in a way that, we might not respond always to a lecture or to nonfiction or, to being told what to do. If we see a very personal story, we inhabit it, we live it, we become empathetic towards it. And it's a way of kind of really touching our humanity. And it helps us put our judgments aside and to live lives that are different from our own. And so I feel like getting under the skin of people and their stories is really important to all of us.
How do you come up with your stories? I mean, of 7 books, yes? 7?
Yes.
I can get the number right.
8 with yours.
Yes. Yay. They're all very different stories. There are some common threads. I think the biggest thread is personal struggle and how self-blame can be such a hindrance to moving forward with things. My blame over Molly's death, self-blame, kept me in a chair for a long time. But how do you come up with these beautiful stories? I mean, they're not just little simple once upon a time stories. They're complex and they're multifaceted, and the connections of the characters isn't always obvious at first, but they're all connected by the last page. Like, how do you do that?
So good story is always about conflict and tension of some kind. And I like to often write from multiple points of view, because I feel that any given story, when looked at from many angles, you suddenly as a reader realize that human stories are much more complex than the judgments that we have of them. And sometimes it'll be a newspaper article that tackles something in modern life that I think, gosh, that's a really interesting, complex, thorny issue that I would like to grapple with on a story level. Actually, with What Milo Saw, my first book, it was the nursing home crisis in the UK, that all of a sudden all these undercover reporters were going into old people's homes and discovering that they weren't being treated with the care that they should be. And often what happens is I'll look at a sort of societal issue, whether it be adoption or mothers walking out on their children or, this crisis in care. And then I'll think of a sort of personal connection to it or a personal story that I've heard or seen. And, at the time I was very close to a sort of grandmotherly figure in my life. And I thought about the relationship between the very old and the very young. And then suddenly I saw a very little boy and his close relationship to his great grandmother. And so it kind of lots of different elements come together, a sort of alchemy, often a social issue and then some personal stories. And then sometimes also I'm an English teacher and I love literature. And so with The Return of Nora Wells, the one that you loved, I was teaching Ibsen's A Doll's House, which is a very old play. And at the end of it, the mother walks out on her small children. And it sort of was published at the turn of the 18th, 19th century. And it was said that when the curtain fell on that play, the whole of Europe shook, because mothers don't walk out on their children. That's just the biggest taboo. And then I asked myself, I wonder what happens when she comes back, because there's an intimation in the play that once she's found herself and grown up, she's going to come back. So many threads come into writing a novel, but often it starts with a sort of social issue. And I think that's why your story appealed to me, because I can't think of a more emotive and difficult subject than child loss. And I often go towards the things that I find hardest. I was a mother of 3 small children when we started talking, and the notion of losing a child terrified me, hearing your story, and it still does. But it also made me feel like this was a really important story. So
good answer. And it led me to my next question. So the first book I read of yours, Gracie and I read it together, As Far as the Stars, with the airplane,
yes.
2 teenagers or 2 young people meet at an airport, and they both have somebody on an airplane, that is now disappeared, and no one knows all of this. So the whole book only spans really 2 days, 2 or 3 days, the whole story. But I remember finishing it and saying, Gracie, you need to read this book. And my daughter, Gracie, doesn't read quickly or easily. She can read the words, but she has to process it. And that's a slow process for her. And she finished it like in 2.5 days, which is unheard of for her. And I said, what did you think? And she's like, how can she write about this so accurately? So Gracie looked at it from her own perspective of losing Molly, the mystery of their loved one, the loss of their loved ones, and sort of how at the very end, things are sort of tied together. And Gracie's like, did she go through this? But I remember that made me want to read your other books. And so I started picking them up and reading them. And I will say, as someone that's lost a child, in the general population, not other child loss moms, because that's a whole different beast, but in the general population, people just don't know what to say to me, and they don't know how to be around me. And even people that walk in on me laughing and they see that it's me, I can see the tension, and they sort of wait to see what comes next. The other piece that I see a lot is when I bring up Molly's name, the expressions on people's faces. And it's a very difficult thing to cope with. So my overall feeling is that unless you've been through it, you don't have a clue. And your books, 3 of them, I think, address the direct effects of child loss. Yeah. And so when I started reading and got to those books, I'm thinking to myself, she must have lost a child because she couldn't write about this. And I remember asking you, did you lose a child? No. So I know this is probably why you're an author and why you write such beautiful stories, is because you have this ability. But how do you do that? Like, how do you really get into someone like a mother that's lost a child and write so accurately about what it does to them?
I think ever since, I think this is a quality of maybe being a writer, like you're an extraordinary runner, and part of it is a huge amount of effort and time and discipline. But there's also that kind of little ingredient that is there, that you're not quite sure where it comes from, but it allows you to do what you do. And there's just a part of my character which makes living really hard, but writing not easy, but it helps me to be a writer, which is that I think I have a capacity to inhabit other people's lives on a very deep and emotive level. It makes mothering really hard because I feel like I'm walking around with all my children's emotions all the time.
Yes.
Even when they're misbehaving, I feel deeply what is going through their minds and their hearts. And so I guess I'm an over empath in that way, but there's something about when I listen to people's stories, I sort of almost wear them like a skin, and I don't pretend to ever understand fully what it is like to lose a child. I don't want to have the arrogance to say that. I think that is the realm of those of you who have gone through it. But there's something about hearing people's stories that really move me, that allow me to use my imagination, I suppose, and my character to live those lives. I suppose actors do that too when they fully inhabit a character. It's sort of method acting, right? Actors, they really live it. And, for those years when we were writing your book, I was reading a ton of memoirs about child loss or about loss in general, people losing their spouses or losing people that are important in their lives. And I saw the common threads, and I feel like I lived it a little bit. And so when I write my books and my characters, I feel like I inhabit their lives. And maybe that's a particular, skill I've been given, which, like I said, it's wonderful for the writing, but hard for the living sometimes.
Right. No, that's a really good analogy. I mean, I ran 50 miles a week and did track workouts and ran really fast enough to go to college for free. And hundreds of people run the same amount of miles every week and do the same workouts and don't. So there's that invisible piece. You create characters that are believable. So even if you, Virginia, don't understand what the mother is going through that's lost the child, or the father, your characters do. Like, you read it, and like, I never once in any of your books have felt like, okay, that's not very believable. Never. I was pulled right into it as a fellow grieving parent, which segues well into the whole process of this. So I remember it was spring of 2020. And I remember it was Gracie's birthday, and you guys came down and we started sort of hanging out, and Sky had just this sort of interest in Molly. And I remember loving it because kids can be so open around, we all think we have to shield children. I think we need the shielding sometimes, and we should go by them. That, they take in things without judgment because no one's taught them to judge. They just take it in for what it is. And I remember Sky's questions around Molly and really wanting to understand what it meant to be dead, and how do you hear about Molly, and where is she, and then going to the cemetery, and just that whole learning experience for Sky. And what struck me about it, I remember specifically looking at my phone, and I had a picture of Molly in her casket, and Sky wanted to see it. And I looked at you like, is that all right? And you were like, sure. And a lot of parents would have been horrified at that whole process, but it was just this beautiful thing. And I remember telling Gracie and Kenny about it, like, that just struck me. And so I think in my mind, that was the beginning of, I don't think I connected, like, I'll have her write my book in that moment, but it started me being a bit more open around actually creating a book. We were on the porch, and it was mayhem in the yard and all of this. And we sort of talked about it. And I asked you, would you be willing to do it? Out came a notebook and out came a pen, and we jotted down some things, and it was, there they are. I know.
I chose pink for Molly. I'm wearing pink for Molly too.
Me too. Tell me a little bit about that from your side, because here's this, locally well-known, relatively crazy person, with a very chaotic life, and trying to pull things together and, brain tumors and kidney transplants and dead children and all the chaos that goes with all these things. And here you are, your family. And how do you remember this whole process? And what made you decide that maybe it was a good thing to do?
Well, first of all, I think, you're like one of the characters that I get to know in my fiction, but in real life. So I met you and I was like, gosh, this is like one of the characters that I would like to write about in one of my books, but she's real.
Yeah.
So that was a feeling I had. It was interesting just the other day as an aside. Yesterday, we were driving to school and Sky said to me, I love it how Barb always answers all our questions and she always tells the truth and she doesn't shy away from everything. And then they all said, oh, we wish we'd met Molly. And then Somerset said, but it feels like we really know Molly. And I remember saying to them, I think Barb would really love that because one of her passions in life is keeping Molly's memory and character alive. And what was amazing for my children was that, they were experiencing their first story of child loss. They'd heard about grandparents passing or pets, but this was really real and raw. But they were coming to understand life. And I think, for me, I want my children to understand life and all its complexity and difficulty and challenges. And when children feel like their questions are answered, and watching you with children, I mean, you're a natural educator, but you have such a gift with connecting with young people. And Sky, my eldest, who has these deep philosophical questions, she felt so seen and validated and heard because you told her the truth about things in a way that was loving and was gentle. And so I think your temperament, your character, also quite simply, you are a natural storyteller. I know it's a challenge for you to write about Molly, like on the page, but that's why you're a great podcaster and so on. So there are so many things, just watching you with my children, this extraordinary story of Molly, watching it infiltrate my children's lives. And she's like a living character in our lives, and as actually we were again talking just yesterday and said, we realized we were packing up our lives in England to come here just as she was dying.
Right.
So it was 2016. So just as we were preparing to cross the Atlantic was when she was in her last days. So there was a real kind of coming together there.
Very much so. I agree.
And so I think, your personality, I think your honesty, your authenticity, your truthfulness, your connection to young people, and one of the things I learned when I was reading lots about child loss was the common thread that people say. And there's this famous actor, Robert Delaney, who wrote this beautiful book called A Heart That Works. His 3-year-old died of a brain tumor. And he just says, people don't want to talk about child loss or about death. And we need to talk about it. We need to air it and to share it because it's really, really hard for the people who go through it. Story appealed to me. You, I think most of all as a character appealed to me. I don't think I've ever met anyone quite like you.
That's probably good.
And I felt like you deserved a story to be told, and just my children's response to it too. I don't know why you were put through this terrible, terrible ordeal, but I know that part of the goodness that we can draw from it is telling the story.
Right. Yeah. And the whole why, I mean, that's the whole impetus for the podcast. Jack's birth really, solidified and opened my eyes to things in a way that I didn't anticipate. And so the podcast, the idea came when he was like 5 weeks old. And I do have a much easier time telling things than writing them down. I had 2 or 3 people read the book. So I had Margaret read it, wonderful Margaret Porter, Paul Brogan, and David Cummings. So 3 local people that have either are authors themselves or work in the media industry. And 2 of the 3 really know me super well. And their comments were that they could hear my voice. I mean, the story's mine, but you penned the words. When you create fiction, it's your story. You create the characters. You decide what happens next. You create and weave the fabric of the story because you've made it up, so to speak. So now I'm like imposing a story on. How is this different for you? How did you do it where it really sounds like I wrote those words?
One of the things that we try to do as authors, if we want to write well, is to make ourselves as invisible as possible. When you're reading a great story, you don't want to have the author's voice in your head interrupting the narrative. My mum always says when she reads my books, she just forgets that I wrote them. I love that. And I think I really try hard when I write about characters. Even in fiction, you still sometimes kind of, introduce your ideas or your thoughts or your style or your voice. And with memoir and writing for someone else, it was taking all of this one step further where I had to become completely invisible. I didn't want anyone to feel at any point in the book, oh, Virginia's writing this, or this sounds a bit like Virginia. And also, I'm an English person from across the Atlantic with a very different character and temperament and style to yours. And so it was a really good discipline, actually, as a writer, to try and become completely invisible as an author and to only tell your story in your voice. I think one of the things that helped both of us in the process was I'd send you lots of questions and then you would reply through an app that we used, a sort of dictation app. So I remember going on long walks and I would listen to your answers. And I think I lived with your voice in my head for probably about 2 years. And so I got used to your turns of phrase. And often I don't know if you noticed, it was a bit sneaky, but I'd get you to retell the story several times in slightly different ways. And then I'd listen to the 3 versions and I'd kind of pull the best bits for the story. And every time you told the story, it might be slightly different, but you'd emphasize certain things, or you have a very particular way of articulating things. And I tried as best as I could to capture that on the page. And if I managed to do that at least a little bit, then I'm really glad.
When I tell the story of how this came to be, and when I actually talked to Paul Brogan about it, when he said, I can't believe that you didn't write this. I can totally believe that Virginia did, because he knows you as an author. But it was really mind-blowing for him. We emailed back and forth several times about it. Like, he couldn't wrap his head around it for a bit. And I shared with him that I told you the story and that you listened and listened and listened, and you wrote the story from what you heard. And while I wasn't aware that you were asking me the same thing 2 or 3 times for any other reason than maybe you needed to hear it again,
yeah,
I get it. You can tell the same story 3 times, or you can have 3 people listen to a story and then separate them and have them tell you what they heard, and you get 3 different things. We intuit what stands out to us. So by listening 2 or 3 times, you stepped out of your intuit into the, I need to hear all the sides, which actually helps to answer a question for me around how you can so accurately write about things like child loss and family loss and tragedy and political issues. You're mindful to take in all sides.
Yep.
I'm going to look at it as a mother. Now I'll look at it as a friend. Now I'll look at it as a father. Now I'll look at it as a coworker. Like, one story, and the audience is all these different people. Another thing that I can't answer for you is, so we sit on the porch. I'm in a bathing suit. We're talking about, would you write a book for me? And you start to sort of outline what we'll talk about. And then I tell you, well, by the way, having an IVF transfer in 5 days and see if I'm going to have a baby. And you were one of like 5 people at the time that even knew that was all happening. So you're walking home with your crazy family that day, your wonderful crazy family. And so as you really embarked on it, what was going through your head? Like, what were you thinking, or how do you remember the beginning of the process, and what stands out, if anything?
I think one of the tricky things about memoir is, in fiction, you can kind of shape it. And if you think, oh gosh, that's a bit too much, too radical for that character, I can trim it down, or I can cut it out. And with you, the deeper I went and the more I asked you questions, the more fantastical your life seemed. And I remember thinking and saying to you, I think, if I was writing fiction, my editor would say, you can't write about child loss and then have a woman give birth at 57, because that's too much for one book and your reader won't believe it. And it's, too strange. And so I think it was one of the challenges was taking your remarkable life, which, by the way, we could have written, 10, 20 volumes beyond what we wrote. But I think that was part of the skill, wasn't it? Was pulling out the bits that we wanted to tell for this book. Was trying to understand what were the overarching threads. And I think that's why the title of the book is so great, Motherland, because it ties together the improbability of bringing together something, like child loss, which just overtook your life so completely. And then, this extraordinary miracle baby that happened so late in life, and somehow ties them together, because Motherland is about how as mothers we inhabit a landscape that is rich and varied and complicated and devastating. And in your own personal story, you go from one extreme to the other. You go from complete loss to creating new life. So at first I was kind of slightly terrified, and I was like, oh gosh, how do we make this work? Do we have a whole separate book for Jack? Do we not mention it? Do we mention it? We went back and forth quite a lot. Do we include it? And what was interesting, quite late in the editing process, actually, one of our editors said she wanted us to bring Jack in earlier in the narrative to kind of balance out, the loss and then the kind of light and the hope that comes from Jack. But also, I think one of the things we trod on very carefully, and I love this about you in writing your story, is that there were no neat or cliched answers. So when someone hears that you have a baby, the automatic thought is, okay, she's lost a child, so she's giving birth again, and now everything's fine because she's replaced the dead child with a new child, and now life is great. But one of the things that I found striking, and I think was very honest about with the book, was that in a way, having Jack was almost like a complete, I mean, it was deeply tied to Molly, but it didn't take away from the grief at all. It didn't make the grief lesser. It didn't improve on the situation. It didn't replace Molly. It was like a separate thing. And I think that's really important for us to understand with grief, is that just because something good happens in your life, it doesn't, so this actor, Robert Delaney, he went on to he has 3 boys now, I think. And he's like, I love each of them profoundly, but none of them makes up for the loss of my little boy.
No.
And so whenever you threw something at me, I think I treated it as an opportunity to write about a really interesting part of the human condition and about grief,
Right.
So rather than simplifying life, you complicated it. And by complicating it, you make it more real.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, simplifying has never been a skill for me. I always often compare my brain to a camera. So I have a wide angle lens for a brain, and you also have a wide angle lens in terms of what you take in, but you have telephoto capability to narrow it down to what the most important thing is. And that's always been difficult for me to be able to narrow the focus. Oftentimes the first question people will ask me, well, they say, why? Like for example, I was at a fundraising event Saturday night, and I met this wonderful couple. I wrote about them in this week's email, and we sat down and we started chatting, and they were a bit older than me, retired, and we're chatting away. And I said, well, I really should go. I have a 2-year-old at home. And their immediate response was, oh, your grandchild? And I said, no, I had a baby when I was 57. And they both looked at me like, why? What were you thinking? And so we chatted about it. And of course, Molly came up, and come to find out, this gentleman lost a child in April, a 38-year-old, but still that's his son and his firstborn. And he can't talk about it without crying because he's 5 months into this horrific journey. So I thought, okay, this is why I'm at this fundraiser I would never come to, it's all these fancy people where I didn't feel like I fit in. But we had this amazing conversation. And one of his first questions was, do people assume that you had Jack to make up for Molly? And I said, all the time. But it's not his job to replace Molly or make up for Molly, just like it's not Gracie's job to be enough, because we talked about how upset Gracie was when she found out I was pregnant. And she just took it so personally, like an affront to her ability to be a good daughter and a good sister. Aren't I enough? I'm still here. Well, it's never been your job to be enough. Like, you're completely enough to be Gracie. And that's the only job you have, is to be yourself, not to replace Molly, not to step in now and be 2 daughters. And Jack, I was a bit nervous at first when I found out Jack was a boy, but it's been wonderful because there's no comparison. Say what you want about gender. Girl babies and boy babies are nothing alike.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Oh my gosh. Nature and the unexplained aspects of all that we see and experience are wonderful sometimes. But has Jack replaced a lot of our sadness and anxiety with joy? Yes, because there's not a lot of time to get lost in the sadness. He's climbing on something or being hilarious or wanting attention. And so he can pull me up out of some pretty dark times. Now here we are. So let's talk a little bit about the editing process. One thing I liked about how we went about this was that you wanted the whole story, and we wrote the whole story, which I think is the only way to write a story. And then if you have to take things out of it, so, there's the whole medical malpractice in the lawsuit. I talk about it comfortably because it was all over the news, and none of that could be in the book. I can't lay blame. I can't share any of that process, but I can't tell the story authentically to you without telling the whole story. So people ask me sometimes, how did you write it by leaving it out? And I'm like, well, from my end, we didn't leave it out. I told the whole story, and then we removed what we couldn't share. So to me, we could have written it and left it out, but I feel like we would have been moderating the story that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I feel like I often liken it to, a sculptor with his, piece of marble, or a potter with a lump of clay. You need all the material there, and then you shape it. And I think because there was so much material, I think we needed to write it all down and then step back and see, okay, what is essential to the telling of this story? And that's why writing books takes so much time, because you write several drafts, but also you need the time to be able to put it down and then look back at it and then see it for what it is and understand which bits fit and which bits don't fit. And actually also because and this is part of the ghostwriting process that I thought was so important, I needed to write and listen to and watch hours of deposition tapes to get to know you, even if those words never make it into the final published book.
Right.
So none of it was wasted. And I find this when I write fiction too, sometimes there are 20, 30,000 words or more that never make it to the final copy, but I needed to write them to get to know the story. And so I think the work, the labor that we did together, the thousands of words that we wrote that aren't in this book as it is on the shelf, were part of us understanding, what needed to be in the story, but also for me to understand my subject. I mean, gosh, watching you going through that process of being questioned about your role in the months and days and weeks leading up to Molly's death, it was so devastating and harrowing, but also it showed me your strength and your character. And I wish we could have kept a lot of it in because I think it made for a really good story, and maybe in the future we can. But yeah, editing is actually a really magical and creative process. Some people think, oh gosh, this is really hard. The really fun bit is the writing, but actually the editing is where the magic happens, isn't it?
Well, and I can agree with that now. When we started this process, so for those of you listening, Virginia finished the book and it took me about 8 months to even read it. Which is I'd start and I'd have to stop. I'd start and I'd stop. I just wasn't in the mindset to take it in. And then when I finally read it, was just, it brings me right back. But as we started the process with editing, just you and I at first, and then when the Atmosphere folks came in and really said, look, here's what needs to happen. We edit down. And I'm like, no, that's part of the story. And then I realized that it's part of my story, but it doesn't mean when somebody reads my book without it, that they won't be told a story. Like that's a distinction that I don't think I really understood until we had gone through this a few times. And once I understood that, I remember sitting on my living room couch and we had to shorten. And there were a couple of chapters where I'm like, okay, we can take this out. And one of them was the Maura chapter, my friend Maura. And I didn't want to take any of it out initially because it was like my chance to share her. But so much of it really wasn't necessary to make the point. And learning how to call that out was really, really helpful for me. And now looking back on it, I can say that editing, it's like weeding a garden. Maybe the wildflowers that are the weeds are beautiful, but that's not where they belong, so you weed them out and then you have this beautiful garden.
We were trying to craft the reader's experience of the story. And so by removing the things that weren't necessary for them or not vital for this particular book, I think we've hopefully made the reader experience much, much richer.
Yeah. So as this airs, it is October 16th. So we're a week away from the book signing at Gibson's. I'm terrified. You've done some book signings. So here we are. We're at this final process. We've chosen a cover. We've edited and recrafted and reorganized and cut away and added words and words and words to the story. Now we're trying to get people to come. What is this aspect of this like for you? Now I'm going to make you sit next to me because I can't sit there and say I wrote the book. This was a group effort for sure. So maybe people listening have never been to a book signing. What exactly happens and why do we do this? And tell me a little bit about Gibson's.
So I often liken, the writing of a book to the gestation of a baby and then the delivery. And then, people want to come and see the baby and coo over it and get to know the baby and hold the baby. And that's very apt metaphor, I suppose, for Motherland. But it takes a huge amount of time and effort and emotional kind of energy and creativity to launch a book into the world. And I think with memoir in particular, it's very personal and you have to be very vulnerable to write in a way that is as authentic and truthful as you have in this book. And so what's wonderful about a book launch or a book event is it's a chance to gather people together who love stories and books, who love you, who loved Molly, to come and hear about the process, to hear you reading from the book, which I think with memoir is really, really special. And I think particularly because we worked so hard on capturing your voice, to be able to hear it in your own voice. Readers, even with my fiction, they often say it's so nice to hear you reading, your book out loud. So I think that's a real treat, hearing an author reading from their own book. So I think what will happen is, we'll sit at the front and we'll have a conversation and I will kind of ask you questions about the book and the story. and then you'll give a reading of the book, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And that's often also where the magic happens, where people can ask their own questions and maybe share their own stories of loss or grief, or also do what I think, Barb, you have allowed us to do from the moment that you found out that Molly was not going to wake up, which is you've allowed us to share in your story. You know, we talk in the book about that week when you allowed the world to come and say goodbye to Molly. And I think the book is an extension of that. You're allowing people to ask the questions that are hard to ask, or that we feel afraid to ask, or that we shy away from. And so I hope in that question and answer session, people will be able to be really open, and that it will start a conversation, and it will allow people in modern life to talk about grief in a way that we don't. We're so far removed from death. You know, we lock it away, and everything is sort of so sanitized, and we pretend as though death doesn't happen, I think, in our society often. And so I think it's really healing to talk about death as a part of life. So I think it's going to be a really special time. So yeah, a conversation, a reading from you, hopefully a really wonderful question and answer session. And then you'll sit at a table and you need to practice your signature.
I know. This is my biggest fear. My name.
You know, practice your name. But I'm just reading Nathan Hill. He's just released a great book. He's coming to Gibson's, and he just does a big NH and the big, you can do just your initials or whatever.
I'll probably just do Barb, because I just go by Barb.
Barb, and I think that's your brand, isn't it?
Yeah. There was a time when I'd be like, Madonna, Cher,
yes,
Barb.
Barb. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And then what's lovely about the signing is it's not actually just you writing your name in a book. It's people who are queuing up, and they have a moment with you, and they might share a personal story or anecdote. You might inscribe something that's special to them, or they might actually, because with this kind of memoir, so I have a friend, Marjorie, who I write with in Gibson's, and she wrote about her husband who had Alzheimer's and then passed away. And I remember when I went to her book launch, I asked her to make the book out to a friend of mine whose husband was in a similar position. And so I imagine with this book, some people will buy your book to put into the hands
of someone else.
Someone else who's grieving or struggling or needs to understand better. And so I just feel there's something very simple about those sort of book events, but also very, very profound. And then happening at a local bookstore, these local independent bookstores, they're the heartbeat of our community. They're where people come together. It doesn't matter who you are or where you're from or what your background is. You feel welcomed and at home, and you feel safe there. And Gibson's is a very, very special part of our community, and the booksellers know us and they support local authors. And so it's a really precious time. Yes, they have the big celebrity authors, and that's really exciting. But I think the really special events are when you have these local authors who come and share their stories, and they're held in a beautiful community of readers and writers. And so yes, I urge you, if you're anywhere near Concord, New Hampshire, do come along, because it's going to be a really wonderful experience. And it's part of I suppose, writing memoir or fiction or whatever you write, it's part of advancing the human conversation.
Right. Right. Well, and that's the best part for me. I think I recently wrote either an email or a blog, and I was talking about stories, sharing our stories. And the whole point of that is to generate connections and conversations. That's what stories do. We both like it, or one likes and one doesn't, but it creates conversation. And now we're talking about something. I do know in the feedback I've gotten, I've shared it quite a bit on social media. A lot of the people that are willing to travel are other angel moms, I call them, other families that have gone through child loss. I'm also hoping, and I'm putting this out here so that we'll have to do it, is to hit some other independent bookstores in New Hampshire. The response I got from I belong to a group called Ellie's Way, and a group of us got together, and all of the moms there wished, I wish I could write a book. I'm like, well, you can, give yourself time. I was the furthest along in my child loss grief in this particular group. And, I wouldn't go back. I wouldn't go back any sooner to it ever. Mm-hmm. One of the moms was just coming up on a year, and I was just still a devastating mess a year after Molly died. I would never want to be that close to it again, which is sort of a weird, grief is just so weird. Everything you say has two meanings inside the heart of a mother, so it's interesting. I really want to thank you for being willing to do this for me.
Something that people should be aware of when writing, reading this book is that, you had to relive those scenes and those emotions over and over and over again. And if I'm editing a fiction book, it might be laborious or boring or dull or repetitive at times. But for you, it was really hard. It wasn't just telling your story once. It was reliving it and reliving it and reliving it. And you've done that as a gift to us. And I think that's extraordinary that you've done that. And I think that many, many people will thank you deeply for having done that work, because I think some grieving parents simply can't. That's why it's not about necessarily just being able to write a book. It's about being able to relive moments that are just so tremendously painful.
Yes.
So I think you were put in the world, Barb, to speak certain truths that help people, who struggle with their own lives or you're a sort of spokesperson for all of us in that way. So it was such an honor writing this book. I'm so excited to see it out in the world, to see how people respond to it. I've learned more than through anything that I've written. And it was wonderful to work together.
Right. So if people want to find you, like on social media or online, where do they find you?
I'm Virginia Macgregor. Macgregor is Macgregor. And you can find me anywhere, really. I've got an Instagram account, Virginia Macgregor Writes. I've got a website, virginiamacgregor.com. You can look at my books up go and ask your independent bookseller to order a copy, or you can find it online on bookshop.org or IndieBound or Amazon. And also I'm very responsive. So if you have questions about the writing process, or you're considering writing a memoir yourself, you can email me through my website, and I'm happy to, to field any questions. The more stories that we have out in the world about people's lives, the easier it is for all of us to live.
Right. That's t-shirt worthy right there.
And that's what we learned, isn't it? With all your stories, that silence is the thing that sort of kills us all, I think. Actually airing it and being open, it allows us to breathe and to survive.
Well, silence can be deafening. That's my experience with it in many aspects of my life. Thank you, Barb. 1,000 Tiny Steps. Thank you so much for listening today. As always, when I wrap up my podcast, the first thing I want you to do is to be good to yourself. So Virginia, go have a cup of tea or a walk in the woods or pat those 86 cats you live with.
I know, cuddle this one. Exactly. In another podcast, I have to tell you how this extraordinary Barb drove my cats all the way to New York, even though she's allergic to them and doesn't really like cats when I moved
and in Boston, and I picked them up.
That tells you everything you need to know about Barb and her generosity.
I will say, when I show up at Virginia's house, the cats all run though. Like, oh no,
don't take us to the airport.
Exactly. So that's us being good to ourselves. Be good to someone else. It's important that you pass along your self-love to others. And as always, have a good day, everybody.
Hey, thanks for listening and supporting the podcast. Feel free to leave a review and share my stories with your friends. Please reach out with your own stories, as I love connecting with my listeners. If you would like to get to know Molly, head over to mollybfoundation.org to see what she is all about. If you want to see what I'm up to next, you can find me on Instagram at Barb_444, on Facebook as Barb Higgins, and at my website, 1000tinysteps.com. And while you're there, sign up for my newsletter, a weekly way to find out what's up in the life of Barb Higgins.